Joining us now to discuss the toll of South Sudan's humanitarian crisis, Emira Woods is an Associate Fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies, and Brian Adeba is Associate Director of Policy for the Sudans and the Horn of Africa at the Enough Project. Well, thanks to both of you for joining us. Brian, let me start with you. We just saw that report from our correspondent in Juba, a very disturbing report. What do you know about conditions inside South Sudan right now?
They are as elucidated in the story. The situation is really grave. But at this particular point, I think the important thing to note is that the famine itself is a symptom of a much bigger problem, and that is the persistence of war. And while it is a good thing to respond to the humanitarian needs of the people that are affected by this famine, it is imperative for the international community to also look at the root causes of the war. In the absence of that, we will just be treating the symptoms, and we will be witnessing such situations coming up again in South Sudan.
Right. Emira, Brian makes a great point there. This is a crisis that could have been avoided. It's not caused by, for natural reasons or anything like that. This is a manufactured crisis. We have 1.5 million South Sudanese who have fled their homes because of rivalries between the president, Salva Kiir, and his former deputy, Riek Machar. I want you to take a listen to a woman who's been displaced and hear what she had to say. Let's watch this.
There is hunger in South Sudan because the food in the farms and in the village are not there any longer. These people haven't left it alone. They burned it all. There's no food coming in from rural areas anymore. When we could buy 1 cup of wheat for 50 or 60 pounds, now a cup costs 150. Imagine if you don't have that money, or if you have no money to grind the wheat, what would you do? And we don't have voucher cards.
How serious are the food shortages there?
Well, you know, Brian hits the nail on the head. The food shortages are severe, as the UN has underscored this just this week, but it is a crisis that should have been controlled. The issues are many. First, it's the political crisis, right? The world's newest nation is at odds with itself, fighting over control of oil, primarily, right? So control of a vital resource has led to conflict since 2013. And it's people, farmers, or women like this being forced out of their homes in the millions, both refugees and internally displaced. So getting at that political crisis is primary. But the other issue is really an environmental crisis that's underway across the world. And Africa is at the epicenter. So when you think about that very oil, what it is contributing to is climate change, global warming that is having disastrous effects, which is now visible across the board from Nigeria to Sudan to Somalia and elsewhere. Already drought-prone regions are facing tremendous crisis with this increasing climate change. But the third issue is really, it's economic. The price of oil is down to like $55 just this week. So governments that are so reliant on oil are facing tremendous problems with this crisis of the commodities prices. But more importantly, they don't have the revenue to be able to do what they could ordinarily have done in terms of addressing the needs, particularly the food needs of those in extreme crisis.
So, Brian, here we have the world's youngest country, 50,000 people killed in fighting. And as Emira points out, it's a conflict over oil. How did we get to this situation?
Well, the system that the political elite in South Sudan installed at independence was a kleptocracy. And basically, in this system, the contest for control of the state's resources and institutions of governance was paramount. Unfortunately for South Sudan, this contest was expressed in violent terms, and the people in leadership were not able to mitigate or control the varying ambitions of the factions within the ruling party that were contesting or vying for control of the state. And this is how we got into this conflict. Basically, it's a question of extreme corruption and absence of institutions of governance, and a contest for control of the state, leading both factions in the party to embrace a violent means of control. And that's where we are now, and that's why we have this conflict in South Sudan.
So, Brian, what you're saying is that this is a long-standing problem and a very serious and complex problem. So a solution is not going to be just around the corner, is it?
Well, a solution is possible. And when we talk of solutions, we have to look at the incentive structure that is existing in place. Yeah. And this is where I think financial pressures on the political elite who are behind this war need to be exerted by the international community. Secondly, we need to look at a conducive atmosphere that can bring both parties that are in the conflict to the peace table and to start talking. This is not happening. The negotiating structure within the IGAD countries that mediated the peace agreement in 2015 is no longer in existence, and other competing priorities have distracted the leadership of IGAD from pursuing an end to this conflict, and this needs to happen. Once the parties are all brought to the negotiating table, we have to realize that the inadvertent consequence of stalling on implementing the peace agreement is the emergence of new actors into the armed conflict. Right. And these actors need to be brought to the table for a credible process to ensue. In the absence of that, we will see the same scenario of war unfolding and continuing.
I want to get back to that in a moment, but Emira, if we look at the immediate crisis right now, as you point out, it's a very big crisis that it affects the environment, it affects the economy of the country, etc. But people are fleeing their homes, 1.5 million people displaced. They've ended up in neighboring countries like Uganda, Ethiopia, in Sudan itself. Are those countries able to handle this huge influx of people?
The short answer is no. They are not able to handle the huge influx of people. They have demands on particularly food because this is a drought that's affecting the entire region, really. The resources are very scarce. But what's needed really is for people to return to their farms, to have a measure of security so that they can once again grow their own food, feed their own children, and have a measure of a meaningful life. So in addition to the issues that Brian has raised, I think it is critical for South Sudan that there be an immediate halt to the arms flow into the region. So it's one simple element.
Where are the arms coming from?
Oh, they're coming from, Brian could probably tell us more, they're coming from many countries. And so you have small arms that are flooding into the region. Some are coming in, some say, from supporters that were allied to the U.S., primarily because, South Sudan has many factions that are allied either to U.S. Private military contractors that have flooded the region or to others. So the arms are coming from many different places. It is urgent that a stop to those arms is, this is something that the UN has called for quite some time, but yet an implementation has not been agreed upon. It's one of the issues in the peace negotiations process, but it's also an issue that can happen with external actors making a concerted effort to put those conditions in place immediately. That's an ultimately early and important step towards getting the peace that's needed for people to be able to have some level of normalcy in their lives.
So, Brian, the external elements, if I could put it that way, that are fueling this crisis, that are supplying arms to different factions inside the country, who are they and what's in it for them? Why do they want this crisis to continue?
Well, South Sudan has sourced its weapons traditionally from countries in the former Eastern Bloc, and that is on record. We also need to take into consideration the collaborators who are helping South Sudan get these weapons, and neighboring countries are complicit in this. I don't want to go into details. We are on air, but at the INAF project, we've reviewed where these arms originate, we've mapped out some of the collaborators who have been instrumental in facilitating the government access arms and also the rebel groups. So it's from a variety of countries and also from within the region and also beyond.
Okay, very quickly, we just have a little bit of time left. The diplomatic efforts, Brian, to resolve this. There was a ceasefire, a very shaky ceasefire that was put in place in 2015. That collapsed. What's next? The deputy who fled the country is now believed to be in South Africa.
Yes, and there's a complicity in the region to prevent him from coming back to South Sudan, while he is really essential to the peace process. And there's a charade going on where the government says the peace deal is working, IGAD agrees to that, and the African Union agrees to that. South Africa, which is instrumental in preventing Riek Machar's free movement, has also agreed to that. So we need to really dismantle this structure here that is obstructing peace. The very basic litmus test to know if there's peace is the absence of conflict. But right now in South Sudan, every part of the country is engulfed in new armed groups coming up and fighting the government.
Okay, Emira, very quickly, what role for the international community here?
All hands on deck from the African Union, which has to take a much more bold and leadership role, to the United Nations. The urgency, I think, has been expressed on the food crisis, and an equal urgency is there on the political crisis, and resolution is needed. But also, you know, listening to the voices that aren't at the table, the women's groups, the voices for peace across faiths that are in South Sudan that have been active in trying to forge a path for peace. It is those voices that need also a seat at the table. And you know, as we celebrate International Women's Month, it is critical that those voices be part of the peacemaking process. Otherwise, you may end up with the same actors continuously recycling unworkable plans.